The rain had started just before dawn, a soft drizzle turning into a steady curtain of silver threads over the sleepy streets of Fairview, a town so ordinary it often forgot itself. But that morning, something extraordinary was about to happen inside a small corner diner called Martha's Place, a humble establishment known for its sizzling bacon, bottomless coffee, and the quiet conversations of locals who'd been coming there for decades. At precisely 8:03 a.m., the doorbell above the glass door jingled and a man named Elijah Brooks walked in, as he had done nearly every morning for the last 15 years. He was 71 years old, tall but slightly stooped, with a dignified presence that spoke more loudly than words. His skin was deep and weathered, his eyes still sharp beneath a worn veteran's cap that bore the faded insignia of the 101st Airborne. Elijah was a man of routine: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and the paper. He nodded to Martha behind the counter, who had his usual seat by the window ready, and he moved with that slow, measured gait of a man who had seen far more than he ever talked about. Most patrons knew him simply as Mr. Brooks. Few knew that once, decades ago, he had worn a uniform and carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Fewer still knew that his only son, Marcus Brooks, had risen to one of the highest positions in the country, the Director of Homeland Security. Elijah never talked about that, either. He preferred anonymity, peace, and the quiet life that had always eluded him when he was young. But peace was not on the menu that morning. At 8:17 a.m., the doorbell jingled again, and in swaggered Jake Hanley, a name whispered with contempt in town but never challenged to his face. Jake was 35, broad-shouldered, and hot-tempered, the kind of man who mistook cruelty for strength and fear for respect. He was known for his foul mouth and quick fists, the kind of man who drank too much and blamed the world for his own failures. He had been fired from 3 jobs in 2 years, was on probation for a bar fight, and still strutted through town like he owned it. As Jake pushed through the diner door, his eyes swept the room like a predator scanning for prey, and they landed on Elijah, sitting quietly by the window, reading the paper with his coffee steaming gently beside him. Something about Elijah's calmness irritated Jake. It wasn't the first time he'd seen the old man here. He knew Elijah. Everyone did. And though Elijah had never said a word to him, Jake resented him deeply. Maybe it was the way people treated the veteran with quiet respect. Maybe it was because Elijah represented everything Jake was not: discipline, dignity, strength without cruelty. Jake stomped toward the counter, barking an order for coffee, then turned to look at Elijah again. "Hey, old man," he said, his voice slicing through the morning hum. The diner fell slightly quieter. Elijah looked up, brows lifting politely. "You talking to me?" he asked. Jake sneered. "Yeah, I'm talking to you. I see you sitting there all high and mighty every morning, acting like you own the place. What are you, some kind of hero?" Elijah folded his newspaper and set it on the table, not rising to the bait. "Just a man trying to enjoy his breakfast," he said calmly. Jake's lip curled. "Breakfast? Must be nice. Living off the government, huh? My taxes pay for that coffee." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Martha frowned from behind the counter. "Jake, why don't you leave him be?" she said. "He's done nothing to you." But Jake ignored her. He stepped closer to Elijah's table, his boots thudding on the linoleum floor. "Tell me something, old man," Jake said, leaning in. "You ever actually fight for this country, or you just wear that hat to look tough?" Elijah sighed softly and looked up at Jake with patient eyes. "Son," he said evenly, "I don't have anything to prove to you." The calmness in Elijah's voice enraged Jake. He wanted a fight. He wanted a reaction. And when he didn't get one, something dark inside him snapped. Without warning, Jake's hand swung out, a hard, open-palmed slap that cracked across Elijah's cheek and echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The room froze. Elijah didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He simply sat there, blinking once, his jaw tightening just slightly. The entire diner was silent, stunned, and then a collective gasp swept through the room. Martha shouted, "Jake! What the hell is wrong with you?" But Jake was laughing now, a bitter, ugly sound. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Just teaching the old man some manners." At that moment, something shifted. Elijah stood, slow and deliberate, and though his voice was still quiet, there was a weight to it that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. I fought for your right to act like a fool, Elijah said. But I will not let you disrespect me or anyone else. Jake snorted. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Call the cops. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flip phone, old, scratched, but reliable. He pressed a single button and held it to his ear. It's me, he said simply. I'm at Martha's. Might need a hand. And that was it. He closed the phone and set it back into his pocket. Jake laughed again. What was that? You call your nursing home? Gonna get your bingo buddies down here. The diners whispered among themselves, some shaken, some angry. A few had already pulled out their own phones, ready to call the police if things escalated further. 15 minutes passed. Jake lingered near Elijah's table, circling like a vulture, tossing insults and glares. Elijah returned to his seat and sipped his coffee again, the red mark on his cheek fading slowly. The tension in the room was suffocating. And then, at 8:34 a.m., the doorbell jingled once more. This time, the air itself seemed to shift. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped through the door, his posture straight as a rifle barrel, his expression unreadable. His eyes scanned the diner once, landing on Elijah, then shifting coldly to Jake. "Dad," he said simply. Jake blinked. "Dad," he muttered, glancing between the old man and the newcomer. Elijah stood again. "Marcus," he said, nodding once. "Didn't mean to trouble you." The man, Marcus Brooks, walked slowly across the diner floor, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones lowered. Every eye followed him. Marcus stopped just a foot away from Jake. "You slapped my father," he said, not as a question but as a statement carved in stone. Jake tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "What, this your kid or something?" Marcus leaned in, his voice low and deadly calm. "I am the director of Homeland Security for the United States government," he said. "And yes, that man is my father." The color drained from Jake's face. He stammered, "Homeland Security." Marcus didn't blink. "You think you're tough?" he asked softly. "You think picking on an elderly veteran makes you strong? Let me tell you what strength is. Strength is standing in a foreign land at 19 years old, bleeding for people you'll never meet. Strength is raising a son who defends this country from threats you'll never see coming. Strength," he said, pointing to Elijah, "is sitting here with dignity even after being struck by a coward." Jake's mouth opened but no words came out. He stumbled backward a step. The room was silent but for the steady hum of the coffee machine. Marcus took a breath and straightened his tie. "You're lucky," he said. "Lucky that my father believes in second chances. Lucky that he called me instead of the sheriff. Because if I had my way, you'd already be in handcuffs." Jake swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating. I didn't know," he muttered. Marcus's gaze hardened. "You didn't care," he corrected. "And that's worse." Jake's shoulders slumped. Martha stepped forward then, her voice trembling with fury. "Get out," she said. "Right now. Before I call the police." Jake looked from her to Marcus to Elijah, his lips trembling, and then he turned and stumbled toward the door. The bell jingled weakly as he fled into the rain. The diner remained silent for a long moment. Then someone clapped. Then another. And soon the room was filled with applause, not for Marcus, but for Elijah, the man who had endured humiliation with grace and strength. Elijah shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Elijah nodded. "Takes more than that to knock me down," he said. Marcus smiled faintly. "You always were tougher than me." Elijah chuckled. "Don't let your agents hear you say that." They both laughed softly, the tension slowly melting away. Martha brought Elijah a fresh cup of coffee, on the house. "You're a better man than most, Mr. Brooks," she said. "And your son, well, I think we all feel a little safer knowing he's out there." The rain outside had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like polished glass. Elijah took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Life had taught him that evil often looked loud and brash, while real strength was often quiet and steady. And as the diner returned to its usual hum of clinking plates and soft conversation, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride, not for himself, but for the son he had raised, and the country he had served. The rain returned by nightfall, a relentless downpour that hammered the streets of Fairview as though the heavens themselves were furious. In a small one-bedroom apartment above a mechanic's garage on the edge of town, Jake Hanley sat hunched over a bottle of whiskey, his hands shaking and his mind spinning. The events of the morning replayed over and over in his head like a cruel film he couldn't pause: the slap, the gasps, the quiet strength in Elijah's eyes, and above all, the cold, unblinking stare of Marcus Brooks, Director of Homeland Security. Jake had walked out of Martha's place a free man, but he didn't feel free. For the first time in his life, he felt genuinely terrified. Homeland Security, he whispered into the empty room. The words themselves carried a weight that pressed on his chest. He had made enemies before: cops, bar owners, even a judge or two, but this was different. This wasn't just some guy with a badge. This was the government. And Jake had struck the father of one of its most powerful men. 1,000 paranoid thoughts raced through his mind. Would they arrest him? Were they watching him right now? Would Marcus use his power to ruin him? As lightning lit the sky, Jake poured himself another glass and swore softly. It was just a slap, he muttered. Just a stupid slap. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was the moment he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Across town, in a quiet suburban home on Ashwood Lane, Marcus Brooks sat at his father's kitchen table, still wearing his suit, though his tie was loosened and his sleeves rolled up. Elijah sat across from him, nursing a cup of tea. The mark from Jake's slap was gone, but Marcus saw it even if it wasn't there, and every time he thought about it, his jaw tightened. "You should press charges," Marcus said. Elijah shook his head. "I told you, I'm not interested in revenge." Marcus leaned forward. "It's not about revenge, Dad. It's about accountability. He assaulted you in front of a room full of witnesses." Elijah gave him a long, steady look. "And what would that do? Put another angry man in a cell. Maybe teach him a lesson, maybe not. But it wouldn't change who he is." Marcus sighed heavily. "People like him don't change unless they're forced to." "People like him don't change unless they want to," Elijah replied. "And no judge can make that happen." Silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Marcus stared into his tea, frustrated. "You always were better than me," he said quietly. Elijah chuckled. "No. I've just had more time to learn when to fight and when to walk away." But as much as Elijah wanted to move on, fate wasn't done with Jake Hanley. 2 days later, as the morning sun broke through the clouds and Fairview tried to forget the scandal of the slap, an unmarked black SUV rolled into town. It parked across from Jake's building, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't wear badges on their belts or sunglasses on their faces, but they carried the unmistakable aura of federal agents. They didn't go to Jake's door. They didn't knock. Instead, they walked into the diner. Martha was wiping down the counter when they entered, and she froze for a heartbeat before composing herself. "Coffee?" she asked. "No, ma'am," one of them said. "We're here to ask a few questions." Within minutes, they had spoken to every witness, gathered every detail, and reviewed the grainy security footage from the camera above the door. They were polite but thorough, and when they left behind a trail of whispers. By noon, the whole town knew that Homeland Security agents had been asking about Jake Hanley. Jake himself learned about it from his neighbor, who burst into his apartment without knocking. "There were suits at the diner," he hissed. "Government types. Asking about you." Jake's blood turned to ice. He rushed to the window and peered through the blinds, scanning the street below. No black SUVs. No agents. But the fear that had been gnawing at him grew teeth. "I'm screwed," he muttered. "I'm so screwed." That night, he barely slept. He paced. He drank. He thought about leaving town, but he had nowhere to go and no money to get there. He thought about turning himself in, but to whom? And what would he even say? "I slapped a veteran and now I'm afraid his son will destroy me." By morning, he was a wreck, unshaven, hollow-eyed, and desperate. Meanwhile, Marcus Brooks sat in his Washington office, staring at a report on his desk. It wasn't about Jake specifically. It was about the rise of domestic extremism, angry men with too much hate and too little direction. Men who thought they were victims but turned themselves into monsters. Men like Jake Hanley. Marcus rubbed his temples. "We can't arrest him for being a fool," his deputy said from the doorway. "No," Marcus replied. "But we can make sure he doesn't become something worse." The deputy nodded. "We've already spoken with local law enforcement. They're monitoring him." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Good. And make sure Dad is looked after." Quietly. "Of course." But Marcus wasn't done. That evening, he made a phone call, one that would change the course of Jake Hanley's life. "Jake," he said when the man picked up, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Jake nearly dropped the phone. "How did you get this number?" Marcus ignored the question. "Martha's Diner. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Be there." And then he hung up. Jake stared at the phone as if it might explode. His first instinct was to ignore the summons, but something told him that would be a mistake. A very big mistake. The next morning, Jake arrived early. He didn't swagger this time. He didn't bark at Martha or sneer at the regulars. He sat in a booth near the door, his hands clasped tightly, sweat dampening his shirt despite the cool air. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bell jingled and Marcus walked in, the same tailored suit, the same unreadable expression. Elijah followed a few steps behind, wearing his veteran's cap. Jake's heart sank. Marcus didn't sit. He stood across the table, towering over Jake, his presence filling the room. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Marcus asked. Jake swallowed. To arrest me." Marcus shook his head. "If I wanted you arrested, you'd already be in a cell." "No, I asked you here to give you a choice." Jake frowned. "A choice?" "Yes," Marcus said. "You can continue down the path you're on, angry, bitter, destroying everything you touch, and you'll end up in prison or worse. Or," he gestured toward Elijah, "you can make this right." Jake's eyes flickered to Elijah, who was watching him with that same calm gaze as before. "How?" Jake whispered. Elijah spoke for the first time. "By becoming better," he said simply. "By learning why what you did was wrong, not just because it was illegal, but because it was weak." Jake's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can." "Then start by trying," Elijah said. Marcus nodded. "There's a program," he said. "For veterans. They need volunteers. People to help with housing, meals, job placement. It won't erase what you did. But it's a start." Jake stared at him, stunned. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance," Marcus corrected. "What you do with it is up to you." For a long moment, Jake didn't speak. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said hoarsely. "I don't want to be this anymore." Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you're already on your way." Over the next weeks, Jake kept his word. He showed up to the Veteran Outreach Center every morning at 8 a.m. He swept floors, served food, carried boxes, and listened to stories from men and women who had endured more than he could imagine. Some spat at him when they heard what he had done. Others ignored him. But a few, including Elijah, offered patience. And slowly, something in Jake began to shift. The anger that had ruled his life for so long began to lose its grip. He still stumbled, still swore too much, still snapped sometimes, but he also apologized, something he had never done before. And every day, he walked a little taller, spoke a little softer, and understood a little more. One afternoon, as he was helping set up tables for a veterans' luncheon, Elijah approached him. "You've come a long way," Elijah said. Jake shook his head. "I've got a long way to go." Elijah nodded. "We all do. The point is to keep walking." Jake hesitated. "Why did you give me a chance?" Elijah looked out the window, where the American flag fluttered gently in the breeze. "Because someone once gave me one," he said. "And because I believe people can change." Even men who lose their way. Jake swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said quietly. Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't thank me. Earn it." Months passed, and Jake did just that. He earned the trust of the veterans he served. He mended relationships he had long ago broken. And though the memory of that morning in Martha's diner never left him, it became the fuel for the men he was becoming, a man his younger self would never have recognized. Elijah and Marcus watched from a distance, never interfering, never boasting. They had not sought revenge. They had sought redemption. And in doing so, they had changed a life. On a quiet spring morning nearly a year after the slap that had changed everything, Jake walked into Martha's diner again. This time, he didn't stomp. He didn't sneer. He smiled. Elijah was there, as always, at his usual table by the window. Jake approached slowly. "May I?" he asked. Elijah gestured to the seat across from him. "Please." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the blinds. Then Jake spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavier than they looked. Elijah nodded. "I know." Jake met his eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Elijah's smile was gentle. "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about letting go of hate, yours and mine." Jake exhaled, and for the first time in his life, he felt lighter. Outside, the flag on the diner's small pole fluttered in the breeze, a symbol not just of a nation, but of the strength it took to face one's past and choose a different future. Inside, two men sat quietly at a window table, one who had once fought for his country, and one who had learned what it meant to fight for his own soul. And somewhere, far away in Washington, Marcus Brooks read a report on his desk and smiled faintly. The world was full of threats he had to confront, but for one man in one small town, the battle had already been won. The spring air carried the scent of renewal over Fairview, but for Jake Hanley, redemption was not a finish line, it was a road he was still learning to walk. Nearly 18 months had passed since the morning he struck Elijah Brooks in Martha's diner, and though much had changed, the memory remained a compass pointing him toward who he wanted to become. He had become a fixture at the Veteran Outreach Center, eventually taking on a full-time role as a coordinator, and he now knew each man and woman there by name, their stories etched into his heart. He had built bridges with people he once mocked, helped rebuild homes, and even spoken publicly about his past, not to seek forgiveness, but to warn others about the cost of unchecked anger. Yet even as Jake's life began to mend, a shadow loomed beyond the edges of Fairview, one that would test everything he had learned. It began with a stranger, a man who arrived in town one hot June afternoon and sat quietly at the end of the diner's counter. No one knew his name, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning exits, studying faces, lingering too long on Elijah. Martha felt a chill the first time she saw him and mentioned it to Elijah, who simply nodded and told her not to worry. But Elijah was worried. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and something about the stranger's demeanor set them on edge. Days turned into weeks, and the men kept appearing, never ordering more than coffee, never speaking to anyone. And then, one evening, Elijah's truck was broken into. Nothing was taken, but the glove compartment was rifled through, and inside had been an old photo of Elijah and his unit from 1972, a photo now missing. When Elijah told Marcus, the Homeland Security chief's calm mask slipped for the first time. "You should have called me the moment he showed up," Marcus said sharply over the phone. "Dad, this could be nothing, or it could be something very serious." Elijah sighed. "I didn't want to make a fuss." Marcus wasn't satisfied with that answer. Within 48 hours, 2 agents arrived in Fairview under the pretense of a routine visit. They watched the stranger discreetly, ran plates on his vehicle, even checked surveillance footage from nearby businesses. What they discovered sent a ripple of alarm back to Washington. The man's name was Victor Lang, a known associate of a domestic extremist group under active investigation for plotting attacks on federal facilities. And he had been stationed in 3 towns in the last year, each time, just weeks before an attempted bombing. "He's not here by accident," Marcus told Elijah grimly during a surprise visit home. "He's watching you for a reason." Elijah frowned. "Me?" Marcus nodded. "Your leverage. If they know who I am, they know who you are." The revelation sent a chill through the Brooks household. For the first time, Elijah considered leaving town, but Marcus urged him to stay. If we spook him, we lose our chance to find out what they're planning, he explained. So Elijah carried on with his life, though he remained vigilant, and so did Jake, who had noticed the stranger too. One night, as he was locking up the outreach center, Jake saw Victor watching from across the street. Their eyes met for a split second, and in that moment, Jake saw something he recognized: hatred, cold and calculating. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment, wrestling with what to do. Finally, at dawn, he walked to Elijah's house and knocked on the door. "There's something wrong with that man," Jake said as soon as Elijah answered. "I've seen eyes like that before. He's not just watching. He's hunting." Elijah nodded gravely. "I know. And we're not going to let him succeed." From that day on, Jake became Elijah's unofficial shadow. He walked him home after diner visits, kept watch outside the center, and reported anything suspicious to the agents in town. It was a small thing, but to Elijah, it meant everything. "You're braver than you know," Elijah told him one night. "A coward wouldn't stand here after what you did. A coward would run." Jake swallowed hard. "I spent most of my life running," he said. "I'm done with that." The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. On a humid July evening, Martha's Diner was closing when Victor finally made his move. He walked in just before the lights were about to dim, locking the door behind him. Elijah and Jake were the only customers left. "Evening," Victor said smoothly, his accent faint but present. "Mind if I join you?" Elijah glanced at Jake, who tensed. "It's a free country," Elijah said, his tone neutral. Victor slid into the booth across from them. "You are Elijah Brooks," he said. It wasn't a question. Elijah's jaw tightened. "And you are?" "A man who thinks your son has too much power," Victor replied. "And too little accountability." Jake shifted slightly, his hand inching toward his phone under the table. "You've been watching me," Elijah said. "Why?" Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because your son built walls that keep men like me out. Men who see what your government really is. Corrupt. Arrogant. Dangerous. And every wall has a weak point. You, old man, are his." Jake's pulse pounded. "If you're planning something, you should walk away now," he said. Victor's eyes snapped to him. "And who are you?" "The town drunk turned savior." Jake didn't flinch. "A man who knows what it's like to hate everything and everyone," he said. "And a man who learned that hate only destroys you." Victor's smirk faltered for a second, but then he leaned closer. "Then you're a fool." He reached into his jacket, and Jake's heart leapt, but instead of a weapon, Victor pulled out the missing photograph. He slid it across the table. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Elijah stared at it, his face unreadable. "Why take it?" "To remind you," Victor said, rising slowly, "that every man has something to lose." He turned and walked out into the night, disappearing before the agents monitoring him could react. That night triggered a storm inside Marcus Brooks. Within 24 hours, Homeland Security and the FBI launched a full-scale operation, arresting 5 members of Victor's network across 3 states. But Victor himself vanished. The incident hardened Marcus's resolve and changed Elijah's quiet life forever. Security followed him now. Jake too was interviewed by federal agents and thanked for his vigilance. And while the immediate threat had passed, everyone knew this was not over. Victor had made it personal. For Jake, the encounter was a crucible. He had once been the embodiment of senseless hate, lashing out at the world for his own failings. Now, standing face to face with a man whose hate could kill, he understood the full weight of what Elijah and Marcus had been trying to teach him. "He's not coming after just you," Jake told Elijah as they left the diner under the watchful eyes of agents. "He's coming after everything you and Marcus stand for." Elijah nodded. "Then we'll stand together." Weeks later, as summer deepened into August, Jake stood on the steps of the Veterans Center, watching a group of young volunteers carry supplies inside. He had become something of a mentor there, his story spreading quietly through town. Some still refused to forgive him, but others, veterans who had once scorned him, now shook his hand. One of them, a Marine named Collins, clapped him on the back. "Heard you stood toe-to-toe with one of those domestic terror types," Collins said. Jake chuckled softly. I stood next to Elijah. He's the brave one. Collins shook his head. Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about showing up anyway. You showed up. Jake thought about that long after Collins walked away. Maybe, for the first time, he truly had. On a late August evening, Martha's diner was as lively as ever. Elijah sat by the window, as he always did, sipping his coffee and reading his paper. Jake sat across from him now, not as an enemy but as a friend. Marcus was there too, passing through town on business, his presence as steady and formidable as ever. They spoke quietly about life, about the past, about what lay ahead. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the diner in shades of gold and crimson, Elijah looked at Jake and said something he had never said before. "I'm proud of you." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm trying," he said. "That's all any of us can do," Elijah replied. Outside, the flag fluttered softly in the breeze, a silent witness to the extraordinary story that had unfolded in this small town. A story that had begun with a single act of hate and grown into something much larger: redemption, resilience, and the unbreakable strength of second chances. And though shadows still lingered beyond Fairview's borders, within the walls of Martha's diner, there was light. Because hate could scar, but it could also teach. Because anger could destroy, but it could also be overcome. And because even a man like Jake Hanley, broken, bitter, and lost, could rise from the wreckage of his own mistakes and become someone better. Someone stronger. Someone worthy of the respect of a veteran and the friendship of a son who protected a nation.